Ahoy and welcome! My name is Clemens Helm and this is Codeship Testing Tuesday number 17. Last week we introduced Jasmine, which is a JavaScript unit testing framework. We wrote some specs and asserted expectations. This week we're gonna spy on methods of objects to see whether they get called or not. If you haven't already, check out last week's episode. It will make it easier to follow along this episode. Jasmine is made for unit testing. Unit tests are supposed to test only one component of your application. A component can be a function, an object, a module, basically everything self-contained that acts like a black box to the outside world. You usually want to avoid that your unit tests fail because another component failed. That's why you want to test your components in isolation as much as possible. For example, you don't want to send data to another server in your unit tests. Or you don't want to manipulate a page's DOM. But you want to make sure that the components which are responsible for these tasks get called correctly. How can we do that? Jasmine provides a feature called spies. A spy listens to method calls on your objects and can be asked if and how a method got called later on. Let's say we've got a web front-end application that should send very important information to our web server. We've already got a method for this. We can't actually test that the right request gets sent to the server in the unit test, but we know that we want to accomplish it using jQuery's Ajax method. So in our spec, we can just put a spy on this method to see if it gets called with the right arguments. This spy will replace the Ajax method with a stub that tracks if the method got called. The actual Ajax method won't be called anymore, but that's what we want, because we want to test this behavior in isolation. Let's add the method call now. The very important information that we want to send is that I am the walrus. After the method call, we want to check if the Ajax method actually got called with the right parameters. So we expect that jQuery Ajax has been called with the method post, the URL important information, and the data that I am the walrus. So let's open the spec runner HTML file now to see what's the current status of our method. Jasmine fails, saying that the Ajax method was never called with the given values. So our spy did its job well and found out that we never called the Ajax method. Let's implement the send method the easiest way possible to get our spec working. We call jQuery Ajax with the method post, the URL important information, and the data that I am the walrus. And this makes the spec work. But hold on, we just hard-coded the test data and didn't pass the actual information. We could write another spec with different data to make it impossible to implement the method this way. But I usually like to use random data instead, because it is less effort to write. Let's rewrite our spec to use random values. So let's make a variable called information, which says that I am matRandom. And send this very important information. And of course, we also have to expect the information down here. Now our spec fails, of course. To make it work again, we could try to pass matRandom instead of the walrus. But this fails as well, because matRandom generates a different value every time it is called. So the only way we can make the spec work is by passing the information to the method call. Now our spec works. You might be wondering why I didn't implement it this way in the first place. When I develop software, I write my tests first and then I try to make these tests work with as simple code as possible. I try to implement it wrong or incomplete deliberately, because this way I can prove that my tests aren't sufficient yet. Working this way makes your test suite rock solid, and it's very unlikely that flaws sneak into your application. But when should we use spies for testing and when not? I think spies are handy every time you deal with third-party libraries or with code that you can't test entirely because it breaks the scope of your tests. But one problem of spies is that they are tightly coupled to your implementation. For example, we could use jQuery's post method instead of the Ajax method here. This would be much shorter. We can just write post here, pass the URL and the information, and delete everything else. This makes the same call to the server as the Ajax method before. But when we run our spec again, it fails. Even though the post method calls the hx method internally, our spec fails because it expected additional arguments. It expected an argument data type, it expected an argument success. So spies make it harder to change your code later on. That's why it can become painful to work with them if your application changes frequently. This was it for today, but there will be more on Jasmine next Testing Tuesday. We'll explore how to test asynchronous JavaScript operations. Don't miss out on that, and of course, always stay shipping.